All right, now we're going to start off with an introduction to the .NET framework. And we're going to cover a brief history of .NET and an overview of the framework. We're going to talk about why we would use C# as a language. We're going to compare a little bit of C# and Java, talk about some C# and .NET resources on the web, as well as where to get .NET and related software. So when you talk about the history of .NET's been around since about the year 2001. It's fairly mature by now. It's up to version 4.5, 4.6 even. And it's the basis for Microsoft's programming paradigm. But it has not been Microsoft's go-to language forever. Before that, there were a number of different languages which had the lead and the mind share in the world of programmers. So if we go back a little bit further to before the year, say, 1994 or so, there were two main languages that were used in the Microsoft world. One was called C++. C++ was the grown-up language in Microsoft's world. It was object-oriented, it was compiled, and we'll go into what these words mean later on. But it was very high performance and had fantastic geek cred. You know, if you were going to be a programmer and you wanted people to respect you, you would use C++. But it was very cumbersome at the Windows level, very high barrier to entry. It took you forever to learn how to do anything beyond just putting a button up that said hello world when you clicked on it. And it remained very hard to use for years and years, and it's still fairly hard to use. On the other hand, there was Visual Basic. Visual Basic was a much easier program to use, a much easier language, and it was sort of object-oriented. Instead of being compiled, it was interpreted, which meant that it was a little bit slower. It had fairly low performance. It had absolutely no geek cred at all. C++ programmers were gods among men. Visual Basic programmers were seen to be more like hobbyists and wannabes. It was made for Windows development. It was written specifically for writing programs in Windows, as opposed to C++, which actually came from Unix and was sort of turned into a Windows language. It had a very low barrier to entry, though. You could get started with Visual Basic very quickly. You could have your basic Hello World button and form up in about 5 minutes, and you could go on from there to write some pretty impressive programs without having to have a degree in computer science. And it was wildly successful. It started out, and very soon after it came out, it was one of the main languages for programming in Windows. It overtook a lot of other competitors that aren't even known today. Silverstream, Delphi, other programs that basically existed just to lend their ideas to Visual Basic and then sort of disappear. Well, about the middle of the 90s, a company called Sun Microsystems, which is now part of Oracle, released a programming language called Java, which was a really crazy move, and we'll go into why that is a little bit. Java was really just an impressive idea. It was a bit of software that could run anywhere. Its mantra was write once, run anywhere. And what that meant was you could write a program in Java and you could run it on a Windows PC, you could run it on a Unix box, you could run it on your Commodore 64 if you wanted, you could run it on an Atari 2600 if somebody went to the trouble of writing something that would allow Atari 2600s to run Java programs. It was a pretty great idea. It basically meant that people could write programs in Java and they didn't really have to have a Windows machine. They didn't have to spend thousands of dollars on a Sun box or a Unix box. They could just get a Linux box practically for free and start writing programs right away. As it turns out, you probably don't know much about Sun Microsystems anymore. That's because they essentially went out of business. They were bought up by Oracle. Oracle bought up Java from them, and they bought up their hardware business. One of the funny reasons why Oracle was able to buy them, however, was that in creating Java, a language which could run on any machine really, they more or less reduced the market for their high-end and expensive servers. So Sun made a really good living selling very expensive servers, which ran great and were fairly easy to maintain. They were like the Porsches of the programming world. However, once they wrote Java, a lot of people probably started wondering why they had to spend money on Sun boxes. As a bit of history from an old guy, Sun and the gentleman who ran Sun really did not like Microsoft at all, so I think he thought he was really doing Microsoft some serious damage by creating a language that did not require Windows to run. And he didn't realize that by creating a language that did not require Sun machines to run, he was sitting on the wrong end of the branch he was sawing. And, well, the rest, I guess, is history. You can follow that link if you want in the Joel and Software site to read a little bit more. So, Microsoft reacts to Java, and they basically said, through Bill Gates, anyone who thinks a 9,000-line program that's distributed free and can be cloned by anyone is going to affect anything we do at Microsoft has his head screwed on wrong. That was from Bill Gates himself. Now, I don't know if he ever thought that himself, but very soon after, or possibly right away, Microsoft realized that Java was a pretty great idea, and they signed on to it. They approached Sun for the rights to also use the Java programming language, which meant that Windows now had 3 languages, C++, Visual Basic, and a special version of Java called J++. Right after that, they decided to use their old embrace, extend, and extinguish idea to try and get rid of Java, or at least make it difficult to use Java anywhere but on Windows. They did that by introducing libraries and extensions to J++ that made it so that if you wrote a program using J++, which was their version of Java, you really wouldn't be able to run it anywhere but Windows. So they thought they'd be slick. Microsoft and Sun fell out of love. Microsoft and Sun took each other to court. Microsoft took Java out of the Internet Explorer browser, which was almost the end of Java and Internet Explorer at the same time. But you can read more about that if you want. Okay. After Microsoft realized they could not get rid of Java, they thought, Java's such a great idea, let's see if we can do it ourselves. So, they came up with something called the .NET Framework. The .NET Framework featured 3 different languages. Visual Basic .NET, which was a version of Visual Basic that ran under the .NET Framework, as the name implies. C++ .NET, and a language that started out being called COOL, or Common Object Oriented Language. COOL became known as C#. They decided to follow the little naming convention. If C++ was one better than C, then C# was a half tone above C. They thought they would use the language of music to illustrate how C# was an improvement on C. And along with those 3 languages, the .NET Framework actually allowed the creation and inclusion of as many languages as you could put your hands on. So now that instead of J++, there's J#. There's a version of Python that runs on .NET. There's a version of COBOL and Fortran, for goodness sake, that run on .NET. Perl, Ruby, everything pretty much. Because Microsoft opened up a lot of the .NET Framework and said, hey guys, if you want to write a language that runs on .NET, here's how you do it. So people who are familiar with these other languages decided to make those languages compatible with the .NET Framework. Now, VB.NET and C# remain the biggest languages on .NET. These other languages are sort of bit players. Okay, so the framework consists of a couple of different things. The first part is what's called the Common Language Infrastructure, or the CLI. The Common Language Infrastructure is a standardized specification for what they call a virtual execution system, the VES, which nobody ever remembers. They think of it as the CLR, the Common Language Runtime. Also, something called a Common Type System, a Common Language Specification, and a Base Class Library. Now, the thing to remember about that is what the CLI is essentially a virtual machine that runs programs written in .NET. If you're familiar with mainframe programming, or you're familiar with Java and its JVM, then the CLI is basically the .NET VM. So if you don't know what a VM is, you're not going to be in too much trouble in the class, but if you want a quick overview, a VM is essentially a program that runs inside of an operating system like Windows, and its job, instead of being a word processor or a spreadsheet, is to be another computer. So if you have a VM that runs on Windows, it can run programs of its own. It might be another copy of Windows, in which case you're looking at something like a virtual machine from a vendor, or you're looking at something like the .NET VM or the Java VM. You would write programs, and instead of running on Windows, it would run on the .NET VM or the Java VM. Then you could pick up that VM and run it on Windows, or have a version that runs on Linux, or have a version that runs on the Commodore 64 or whatever, and those programs would run anywhere. So with the CLI, .NET got the Java write once, run anywhere mentality down. So it gets us a collection of common classes that developers can use: type safety, code access security, language interoperability, garbage collection, platform portability. We don't really need to worry about what these are, but if it ever comes up, or if you're ever at a party and somebody asks you what the .NET framework gets us, this collection of acronyms is what it gets us. The last one's interesting: platform portability. That basically means that the .NET framework can, in principle, run on platforms that are not Windows. Like Java, which can run on Unix, Windows, whatever, the .NET framework actually does not strictly require Windows to run. There is actually a system known as Mono, which is the .NET framework, which has been sort of reverse engineered to run on Unix operating systems such as Linux. So if you are fond of .NET or C# and you want to run on something other than Windows, you actually do have the ability to do that. Now that said, Windows is Microsoft's bread and butter, and they put their effort into developing stuff for Windows. So Mono tends to be sort of crowdsourced and tends to be a little bit behind .NET, but it is possible, and Microsoft certainly doesn't forbid it. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we have a managed execution system for running code. Code written in .NET is transformed into something called the Common Intermediate Language, sometimes known as IL or MSIL. Intermediate language is turned into machine code via the virtual execution system. So basically all that means is the VM that we're talking about does not run C# or Visual Basic or C++.NET. It runs a language called IL or MSIL, Microsoft Intermediate Language. Microsoft Intermediate Language is kind of like the assembly language of programs written for computers of days gone by. And if you wanted to, you could actually write programs right in MSIL. There's an MSIL programming environment that I've never used and probably never will, and I don't encourage you to use. But if you wanted to, you could write it. Write programs in it. But the upshot of this is that if you write in C# or Visual Basic.NET or C++.NET or Python.NET or J#, whatever, all that programming gets turned into MSIL, which then runs. That means that the choice of language is really up to you and what you're comfortable with, or what your company or what your team is comfortable with. There are certain features in certain languages that are better executed in other languages, and you could always argue about what language is better than what other language, but it doesn't really come down to something as simple as C++ being really fast and great and Visual Basic being awful. Okay. In Windows, since before .NET and even since, you will probably have noticed that there are little files on your system in folders, and a lot of those files will have extensions like DLL and EXE, along with other things like Word documents and so on. DLLs and EXEs are basically the units of execution in Windows, and EXE a lot of people are familiar with as an executable. An executable can be run from the command shell, for example. You just have a program that runs and says hello world or does whatever. A DLL is what's called a dynamic link library. It's essentially the same sort of code as in an EXE, except that a dynamic link library is something that other programs can use to do certain things. Let's say you have a dynamic link library that can calculate the baseball scores for a certain player. And let's say you have a bunch of different programs that might need it. Rather than putting that code to calculate all the baseball scores and averages into every program that needs it, you just put that DLL out there, and the various programs that need that know where the DLL is and can sort of open that library and use it. Kind of like a web service nowadays, but DLL certainly came first. Interesting thing about the .NET framework, though, is that in the .NET framework, as with Java, programs aren't really run, they're not compiled, they're interpreted. Kind of like, well, they're compiled down into IL, and then the IL is interpreted. So it seems like it's the worst of both worlds, because you're taking time to compile the code and then you're taking the time to interpret the code. But the .NET Framework and the Java VM run things so quickly that you don't really notice. So in .NET, programs and the types of software that make them up are described in code, and they're compiled into something called assemblies. An assembly is still basically an exe or a DLL, but an assembly now contains intermediate language instead of the machine code like in the old days, and when it's needed, the intermediate language in the assembly is compiled into machine code by the .NET Framework. That assembly is compiled using something called a JIT compiler, or a just-in-time compiler. Just-in-time compilers basically mean that the code sits around doing nothing until it's needed, and then it's compiled the first time someone asks for it. And then that code is kept in its compiled state until either it's not needed for a while, or until the code that created it changes and it needs to be recompiled. We can get into more of that later. This is just more of an overview. So as the picture goes, basically up at the top we have our VB.NET code, our C# code, or any other .NET Framework code. It goes in through its language-specific compiler, and it's turned into an intermediate language assembly, which is a DLL or an exe. When the program needs to be called or used for something, then the .NET just-in-time compiler compiles it and turns it into machine-specific code. So that second arrow for the JIT compiler is essentially where the magic happens in .NET. If I have a machine-specific .NET framework for Windows, I could have a machine-specific framework compiler for Linux or for anything else. All that other stuff at the top in the funnel is going to be exactly the same. The assembler is going to turn it into .NET code, and then the JIT compiler is going to turn it into machine-specific code. Better still, if you have a tablet or a Windows phone or a laptop, those are actually three different machines as far as Windows goes, and they have slightly different versions of Windows, but the same code can essentially run on all three. So the machine-specific code generated by the JIT compiler would be slightly different for the tablet, for the phone, for the laptop. Okay, so now we've heard a little bit about the .NET Framework. We're going to talk about why we're learning C#. Now, 10 years ago, this would have been a little bit tougher question, but nowadays it's a lot easier to answer. We learned C# because C# is the main programming language of the .NET Framework, and it has been pretty much since the day it was invented. It took off inside of Microsoft right away. The reason why it was so popular is that it had very similar syntax to C and C++. So all those people who were walking around feeling important because they knew how to program in C and C++ didn't have to learn a new syntax. They could pick up pretty much right away on the syntax. And it has a big and growing academic base. You go to colleges, instead of learning C or C++, you might learn Java, you might learn C#. C# is also designed to catch Java users. So if you like Java, Microsoft has a language for you, C# or even J# through something that they used to call the Java User Migration Program. But the point of that is that Microsoft has a way for you to move from Java to C# so you feel comfortable. As I mentioned, it's also their language of choice. Most demos, examples, tutorials are in both C# and VB.NET, but every once in a while, if you see only one example on a page from Microsoft, it's going to be in C#. It's not going to be in Visual Basic.NET. Any code that you see from some of the better programmers out there, they're all going to be in C#. Now in 2015, much more so than when it first came out, VB.NET has kind of gone back to being a hobby language. Not because it isn't well performing, it certainly is, but just because the taint of Visual Basic is still there, and I think Visual Basic.NET kind of served its job of getting people onto the framework. Also, Microsoft dog foods all of their products using C#. Dog fooding is a term in the industry that means that if you have a cool product, you use it inside of your company. Microsoft has Windows installed on their PCs, and they use Microsoft Office. You're not going to find a bunch of Linux PCs running OpenOffice. You're going to find Microsoft tools. Microsoft's flagship systems, Visual Studio, SQL Server, BizTalk, are all written in C#. They didn't used to be. They used to be written in C++, so it was a difficult argument to say you should use .NET when their own programs weren't written using it. But pretty soon after .NET came out, everything was written in .NET. Okay. If you don't know much about Java, you can jump right over this slide, but some people like to know how C# and Java compare and how they contrast. Some people come from a Java background and they want to know what they can expect. So the good news is they're both descended from C and C++. The syntax that comes from C and is reinforced in C++ is extremely popular. Not only does C# use it, Java uses it, JavaScript uses it, Perl and Python to a lesser extent use it. It's a very popular syntax. It's a little cumbersome at first, but it grows on you. C# and Java are both object-oriented languages. If you don't know what that means, sit tight for a couple lectures and we'll go very deeply into what that means. But the gist is they both derive from a single base class. They both use inheritance. They use implementation for interfaces. They're basically the same language when it comes to object orientation. There's a little bit of differences, but not much. They're both web-enabled. They both do very well on the web. They both can be used to write web pages and websites. They're both virtualized, which means they run inside of an intermediate framework. They're compiled to an intermediate language, just like Microsoft.NET has the IL, Java has the JVM. They both use something called garbage collection, which is basically a way of getting the programmer out of the business of clearing up objects that were created and sit in memory. There's a program that runs in the background and basically finds program code that isn't running anymore and takes it out of memory to save everybody some time. They both use side-by-side versioning. Side-by-side versioning basically means that if you have version 1 of a program running and you want to install version 2 for someone to use, if anyone's using version 1 while version 2 is being installed, version 2 will go in next to version 1. Once the system realizes that version 1 is not being used anymore, it'll take it out and everybody will be using version 2. Both languages use something called structured exception handling. We'll go very much into exception handling. Both languages pass items by reference, and they also just have a huge number of similarities that are almost too numerous to count here. They both use main as their entry point. They both use semicolons at the end of the lines. As I mentioned, the syntax is very, very similar. Unless you've used both languages pretty substantially, it would be slightly difficult at first glance to tell what language you're looking at, C# or Java. There are some keywords that are different between them, but if you just looked at the code really quick and looked away, you'd have a hard time knowing which was which. That's how similar they are. Now, how are they different? Well, C# and Java do have one main difference. In the world of Java, it was designed so that one language would run on many different platforms. Everyone would write in Java, and they would run it on Linux, or they would run it on Windows, they would run it on the Atari 2600, or on a watch, whatever. And that's fine. Java's a good language. In the .NET world, Microsoft thought it would be a little bit clever to sort of flip it. Instead of having one language that runs on many platforms, it's many languages that run on one platform. As I mentioned, Microsoft sells Windows, so they're not going to go out there and start pitching everyone to start using Linux or the Apple Watch. So they want to target Windows as their platform of choice. But with the .NET framework, they allow you to program in a bunch of different languages. If you like C#'s syntax, you can use that. If you like C++, you can use that. If you like Visual Basic, you can use that. Perl, Python, Ruby, whatever you like, you can use that. And they will all compile down to the same code. So you have many different options. And you can run them all on Windows. As I mentioned, there is Mono that will allow you to run .NET stuff on Linux. But that's not really official. Microsoft supports it, but it sort of does it in the back room with nobody looking. So, here's a question. Is it possible to have a language that isn't Java, but can run in the JVM? And if you want to pause it now and think about it, go right ahead. But I'm going to go ahead and answer it. The question is it possible to have a language that isn't Java but runs in the JVM? And the answer is absolutely yes, you could. Remember, in the Java world, it's essentially the same as .NET. You're running an intermediate language. Java turns into the intermediate language. If you wanted to have something else that could also turn into the intermediate language of Java, you could. There are some languages out there, I believe Groovy is one, that are basically supersets of Java. They use Java and they also use some other stuff tacked on. Those are basically languages that compile down to the JVM. Bonus question 2 I've already answered, but I'll put it out here anyway. Is it technologically possible to have the .NET framework run on a non-Windows platform? And the answer is yes. Not only is it possible, but it has been done with Mono. Again, don't run off and install Linux just to get Mono. You don't want that. You would probably want to stick with Windows. I remember working for a government contractor. I don't go into it too much, but they were working on some battlefield management stuff, and they were moving from Java to .NET. And the project manager heard that you could run .NET on Linux, and he just said, all right, that's it. That's what we're going to do. And all the developers looked at him like, are you crazy? And he looked at me, and I said, no, they're right. You're crazy. Mono is not as well supported as Windows is. If you're going to run a tank on it, please don't do that. Okay. C# also has something called an unmanaged mode. Java does not have an unmanaged mode. And without getting into too much detail, unmanaged mode basically means that you can write code that does not use the .NET VM. It goes right down to the Windows operating system to run. Most people don't really know why that would be necessary or care why that would be necessary. And I can tell you that in 15 years of using the .NET framework, I've never used unmanaged mode. But the C++ people who cut their teeth before .NET came out couldn't live without this. They wanted to be able to run stuff right against the operating system, and so Microsoft allowed it. C# allows for pointers in unmanaged code. If you don't know what a pointer is, you don't have to care. Java does not allow pointers at all. Pointers are basically a messy programming construct that allow you to use a reference to a place in memory, or use a reference to a reference to a place in memory, or a reference to a reference to a reference to a place in memory. And they can be great or they can be terrible. And when Java was created, it was decided that pointers were so awful that they didn't need them. C#, if you're in an unmanaged area, you can use them. There are more value types in C#. We'll get into value types in a little while. C# is not as restrictive on class name and file name. Java requires you to name a file name on disk the same as the class that it's describing, which I don't get, but they do. And C# does not use exception specification. And when we get to exceptions, we'll talk a little bit more about that. I do like exception specification in Java, and there is a way to sort of fake it, but it's not there. Okay, so if you want to know more about .NET resources on the web, the first place you'd want to go is Microsoft.com/net, which is the official site for .NET. www.asp.net, that's their official site for ASP.NET. Anything that basically uses .NET for web development is going to be there. Codeplex.com, which is Microsoft's open source project hosting site. If you've never seen an open source project hosting site, you're in for a treat. If you go to Codeplex.com, you're basically going to see a bunch of projects and software that people have written or teams have written, and they think it's so great that they put it out there and you can use it for free. I've grabbed a number of things off of Codeplex to help me do some task in a larger project, or I've grabbed some software that I didn't want to take the time to write and go out to Codeplex and find that somebody else has already written it for me. It's great. And the Microsoft Developer Network, which is Microsoft's huge and expanding library of everything that is related to Microsoft development. Okay. In order to get the Microsoft software, we're going to go over this a little bit in detail. But to start off, you can go to Microsoft.com/net. And in order to get the software, you're going to be grabbing something called Visual Studio. Visual Studio is Microsoft's IDE for writing anything for any software that they have. IDE just means Integrated Development Environment. It basically means that it's better than just a text editor. If you want to write stuff in Notepad or even Notepad++, you're totally welcome to, but you're in for a long haul when you try and debug it, deploy it, publish it, whatever. There are various ways to get Visual Studio. For the past year or so, there's been a free community edition of Visual Studio. The community edition is great. It's perfectly good for the purposes of this class. It's even better. You can use it beyond that for some pretty respectable software development. We're going to use Community Edition 2013 in this class, and I'm going to show you how to get that in just a minute. If you don't like free and you want to spend money, you can buy a Microsoft Development Network license. They cost about $1,000 or $2,000 a year. In all fairness, if you spend the money on that, you will probably find it worth your while, because not only can you get Visual Studio, you can get the better versions of Visual Studio like Professional and Ultimate, which include things that we're not going to use in this class but are definitely pretty nifty. You can also get free development versions of everything Microsoft makes: SQL Server, Windows, BizTalk, SharePoint, everything, Office, everything. If you work for a company, or if you are a company, you can become a Microsoft development partner. One of the ways to do that is through Microsoft BizSpark. If you have a company that's going to be writing software and you want that software to be Microsoft based, particularly if it's going to be a website, you can join BizSpark. BizSpark gives you a bunch of stuff for free for a period of, I believe, 3 years. One of the companies I'm associated with is a BizSpark company, and I have access to Office and Visual Studio and everything, and I have $150 a month of Windows Azure credits, Azure being Windows Cloud. We're not going to go into that until a little bit later. If you pass a Microsoft certification exam, you get a free MSDN license for 1 year. If you join DreamSpark, which is the student version of BizSpark, then you get free stuff as well. If you have an EDU email address through your class here, then you can use it to join DreamSpark, and Microsoft will throw software at you. Why? Because you're a student, and they think if you use their tools, you're increasing the likelihood that the next generation of programmers will use their tools. And so it's worth giving you some free stuff up front to get you to use that. And we'll be back in just a bit and see how to install Visual Studio.